I want everyone to imagine with me that you are sitting at one of your favorite dashboards in Tableau, one that you need to use to do your job. And perhaps you are red-green colorblind, and the person who created the dashboard didn't account for that. And you can't really understand the dashboard as well because you can't tell certain marks apart from the others. And statistically, some of us in here are red-green colorblind because that's a pretty common thing. But imagine next that you broke your arm doing something recently and you can't use a mouse. And so you've got one hand and you're trying to type with it, and all of a sudden you can't manipulate the filters on the dashboard. Or imagine that you had a more serious accident and you can't use your hands at all. And you have to use some sort of switching device in order to manipulate the dashboard. Or perhaps you are blind and you can't see the dashboard at all, so you can't even get the smallest amount of information from the dashboard. And so these are the kinds of challenges that people deal with every day. And today we're going to talk about how you can create dashboards that are more accessible to people who deal with those challenges. So my name's Kyle Gupton. I'm a director of product management at Tableau. I work with our customers in the public sector, healthcare, and financial services markets to make sure that our products are meeting the needs of those customers. And so it's through my work with public sector that I've gotten involved with accessibility because it is such a key topic for our public sector customers. But it's actually becoming an important topic outside of the public sector as well, in particular in banking and financial services. So today we're going to be going through how you can create and publish dashboards that are more accessible in Tableau. I'm going to start with the basics of accessibility to make sure we all are using the same language and have the same basic familiarity. I don't assume that anybody knows what accessibility is. Then I'm going to turn to a discussion of the web accessibility standards, because we are talking about accessibility for dashboards that are published to one of our web-based platforms, so Tableau Server, Tableau Online, or Tableau Public. Then I'll talk about how we can apply the web accessibility standards in creating your dashboards and how you can start following those standards when you're designing your dashboards. Then I'll go into a case study where I take an existing dashboard and I leverage those best practices that I'm going to teach you to make it more accessible. And then finally, I'll give a demo of actually using that dashboard using only a keyboard and a screen reader on my computer. So let's get going with the basics. So accessibility is the usability of a system by people with disabilities. For people with disabilities. And there are many kinds of disabilities we can talk about. Vision impairments, deafness and hearing loss, mobility disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and so forth. And each type of disability requires a different type of accommodation in the system to make it accessible to people. And there is a wide spectrum of these disabilities. You know, I talked about someone who couldn't use one arm, or someone who didn't have the ability to use their hands at all. You know, there is a big spectrum there. And that's true with vision impairments in particular, and I'm going to get into some detail on that because it's pretty critical to us when we talk about Tableau. And so within computing technology, there's something called assistive technologies, or AT, and these are basically technologies that make computer systems more accessible. So I'm going to give a little bit of example of that. So on our left, we have what's called a keyless keyboard. And so that is basically something that interfaces to the computer like a keyboard, but it's two switches, and it allows someone who has kind of large, not fine-grained motor control, but the ability to have some motor control of their hands to basically manipulate the keyboard by setting these two switches. On the right, the gentleman's using what's called a sip and puff switch to manipulate the keyboard, and it's basically a straw that you sip or puff on. And that's common for controlling all sorts of things like wheelchairs and such, and they exist for controlling the computer. And so it's important to know that both of these attach to the computer they look like keyboards to the computer. And so keyboard access becomes super critical when we're talking about accessibility. For vision impairments, there are a couple of different technologies that can help. On the left, we have what's called a refreshable braille display. Basically, it's a strip of pens that are able to form braille characters in response to text that's on the screen. And on the right, we have some logos for the most commonly used screen reading software. So this is software that reads to you the text that's on a screen. The most commonly used one is JAWS for Windows, which is a commercial product. We also have NVDA, which is a free open source product also for Windows. And then on Mac, the built-in voiceover screen reader is what's most commonly used. Windows also has a built-in screen reader now called Narrator. When Microsoft first launched it, it was pretty limited, but they've been putting a lot of investment into it as well to make it better and make it more of a default screen reader that's free for people. So let's dive into vision impairments, because like I said earlier, vision impairments are pretty important and pretty challenging to deal with when you're working with a visual product like Tableau. So they exist on a wide scale. And I know when I first started working on this, I'd talk to people in the development team, and they'd be like, how do you make Tableau accessible to a blind person? And it's like, well, that's challenging. You know, there's no way around the fact that that's challenging. But there's a whole wide spectrum of vision impairments that are not, that aren't complete blindness. And so I need to update my presentation view here. Sorry, there we go, that's better. So some of these impairments are pretty common. So I mentioned red-green color blindness earlier. So that impacts about 8.5% of males and about 0.5% of females. So close to 5% of the population is red-green colorblind. And other of these are pretty rare. And so being a visual product, again, it's critical that we kind of understand what these are and the techniques that you can use to help people who have these various impairments. So to give some examples of some of these impairments, I've put together some simulations of basically applying filters visual filters to a Tableau dashboard to kind of simulate what it might look like to someone with various vision impairments. So here we have an example dashboard. This is actually an old sample that used to ship with Tableau back in the day. It shows SAT scores for students at some hypothetical university. And we're going to come back to this later because it's the basis of my case study and demo. And so you've got your line chart at the top that shows the SAT score divided by decile, and then a histogram at the bottom that shows the SAT score divided by the male and female students at the university. So the first filter I'm going to apply here is it simulates red-green color blindness. So for someone who's red-green colorblind, the marks start to be more difficult to tell apart. And so especially that's true on the line chart at the top. So now there are a couple different marks that are pretty close in color to yellow, pretty close in color, and they're yellow, or they look yellow, to me at least. On the bottom, we see some change in the marks on the histogram, though you can still tell them apart. Okay? But it just becomes a little more difficult. Now we have a simulation of no color vision at all. So world looks like shades of gray. It's rare, but it exists. So now it becomes impossible to tell apart some of the marks, including the marks in the histogram at the bottom, because they all look exactly the same now. They're the same shade of gray. Okay, so this dashboard becomes increasingly unusable as we apply these various filters. Next is a simulation of what's called contrast sensitivity loss. And this is where it becomes more and more difficult to distinguish foreground and background. And so this is particularly important for text, where it becomes very difficult to read text, because if there's not enough contrast between the text color and its background, then you might lose the ability to perceive the text if you have a contrast sensitivity loss. Then we have low vision. And so this may be the best you can do in terms of visual acuity, even with corrective lenses. And so the person can see, and they can see kind of the basic outlines of things, but can't really perceive any text, can't really differentiate the marks and so forth. And so someone here might typically use magnification software or things like that to make everything bigger. And then finally, no ability to perceive light at all. And so in this case, the person is unable to perceive the dashboard at all using vision. And so they have to have some other way to perceive the dashboard. And it could be Braille, it could be voice with the screen reading software. So those are other modes of perception that the person can use. So this is a bit of a conundrum for us at Tableau, because if you know our mission statement, it's to help people to see and understand the data. Kind of the genius of Tableau from the very beginning was that it leverages our most powerful sense, which is in fact vision, to help us understand the data. By presenting data not as just tables of numbers, but by presenting them as visuals, you can start to understand trends and understand outliers and all those sorts of things that you can't easily do when you're just dealing with the raw numbers themselves. That's the whole point of Tableau. And so, like I said, this is a challenge. Making this accessible for people with visual disabilities is a challenge. So our goals are kind of twofold. So one is to allow more people with visual disabilities to still benefit from the inherent visual nature of Tableau. So it's to help people who are colorblind still be able to benefit from that. It's to help people who have contrast sensitivity loss, who can still perceive by sight the dashboards or your content, but they can, so it allows them to still do that and get the benefit of Tableau. And then it offers at least access to the basic information of a dashboard to everyone, even if they need to use a screen reader software to perceive the dashboard. And so those are our goals. They're kind of twofold. It's kind of expanding the zone of people who can benefit from the core value of the visual nature of Tableau, but still giving access to the underlying data to everybody. So I do want to talk a little bit, just a review of the accessibility laws and regulations. So the big one we talk about, Section 508. How many of you here are subject to Section 508? Usually most people who come to this presentation. So that's a United States federal law that basically sets accessibility standards for the electronic and information technology that the US federal government can buy and deploy. That law also ends up flowing down to state and local governments, particularly when they are implementing federal programs. So state implemented Medicaid programs, for example. And then a lot of states have their own standards where they've chosen to adopt these. So that's the biggest one that we deal with. But there's another one called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is starting to become more relevant to computer technology. The law was originally written for basically what are called public accommodations, typically buildings and things like that. And the standards are mostly around like wheelchair ramps and those sort of like physical accessibility. But there have been more and more lawsuits and such and legal challenges about whether or not a public-facing website for a company, for example, is considered a public accommodation. And so there was a particularly important one recently where the National Federation for the Blind and Visually Impaired sued Target over the lack of accessibility for their website and their mobile apps. They ended up settling out of court, and Target put a lot of investment into making their website and mobile apps accessible. So we're starting to see more and more situations like that, and I think that's really the underlying reason why we're seeing increased interest in accessibility amongst our banking customers. Because bank websites, banking is something that everyone kind of has to do, so a bank website is something that people just need to be able to interact with. So we're seeing some really interesting initiatives within our banking customers there. So the US isn't the only country that has these laws. The UK has something called the Equality Act, which is quite similar to the ADA. And then in the European Union, there's something called Mandate 376, which I think is funny. It sounds like some kind of science fiction thing. But it's very similar to Section 508 in that it sets accessibility standards for computer technology in the public sector of the European Union. Okay, so that's just a little brief review of the law. And so there are also a number of reasons that are worth exploring about why you might care about accessibility, why you might want to make the stuff that you're creating in Tableau more accessible. So first is, and I think the best, is that you care about helping people with disabilities more fully engage in the world. I mean, technology has been a godsend in many ways for people with disabilities because it does help them more fully engage in the world in ways that were not possible before the technology. So another good reason is that you want to reach the largest possible audience with the content that you're creating. You want everybody to be able to see it. And in fact, that's an interesting thing about our mission statement is that we help people to see and understand data. And it's meant to be all people, not just people with certain characteristics or just see people with certain abilities or so forth. So it is pretty expansive if you look at it that way. Another one that people don't often think about are that many accessibility practices are just good usability practices for everyone. So the common example for that is a wheelchair ramp. So, made to help people who use a wheelchair or a walker or otherwise have difficulty with stairs to be able to get access to physical structure. But they're also useful if you're pushing a baby stroller, for example, or a cart or wheeled luggage or something like that. Then I have an example just from my own life where I used accessibility, AT, to help myself in a funny way. So my wife and I are big horror movie fans. And there was a great one that came out a couple years ago called The Witch. It's about this family that lives in the woods in like 1600s New England, and they fear that there's a witch around them. And they speak in actual period English, and it's really hard to understand what they're saying. And so, about the first 20 minutes of the movie, my wife and I were like, oh my God, this seems cool, but I'm not really sure what they're talking about. And so we were watching it on Apple TV, so just flipped over, turned on subtitles, and got the full experience of the movie. And if you like horror, it's a great movie. So those are examples of how accessibility can benefit a whole bunch of people. Additionally, your organization may have its own requirements. That's true in the banking. They're just kind of getting ahead of it and, not necessarily a court ruling or they're not being forced to, but they want to get out ahead of this. I was talking to one of my colleagues last night, and he used to work at Capital One. And apparently they started really putting a lot into accessibility about 6 years ago, which would put them, I think, in a leadership role in their industry. And then finally, I mentioned the laws. It just may be the law that you have to do it. And, I won't say that's the best reason, but I would say it's an example of a law working as intended, because it's forcing technology vendors like us to have to provide those kinds of tools to our customers. Okay. So enough about that. Let's talk about the web accessibility standards, or really the web accessibility standard, because there's really one that we're talking about, and that's what's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. That's how you pronounce the acronym for it. It is a standard developed by a group called the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. That's a standards body that kind of mines the standards that are used in the web. So they have like the HTML and CSS standards. They have standards for how web servers and web browsers communicate with each other and so forth. And they have this set of standards, or this set of guidelines, which is basically both a set of recommendations for making web content more accessible, basically how you code up websites. And then they also have a set of technical aspects to it that allow that you have to follow for assistive technology to be able to interact with that website. So assistive technology can kind of understand the structure of a website and kind of what its various pieces are. And so these are all set by the W3C through the WCAG standards. Something that's really important for those of us subject to Section 508 is at the beginning of this year, Section 508 aligned their web-based application standards with the WCAG. Prior to January, Section 508 had its own web-based standards that were different than the WCAG, and they were pretty antiquated because they were developed before the Web 2.0 kind of interactive web technologies, and they were basically designed for basic web pages. And so this was a great development because one, it's a way better set of standards. It's way stricter. You could get away with a lot with the old Section 508 standards because they were designed for desktop software, but not really for web software or complex web software like we have now. And then also, the WCAG is the international standard. And so when I talk about the UK Equality Act or Mandate 376 in the EU, those all align to the WCAG as well. So that's good for companies like us because it gives us one standard to shoot towards rather than having a mishmash of different standards across the world, because we do serve customers all over the world. Okay, so the way the WCAG is organized is it's set up amongst 4 principles with associated guidelines. So the first 2 principles are perceivable and operable. And basically what it means is that content on a website needs to be perceivable in a way that someone can perceive. So you can't require only vision to be able to perceive something, or you can't require only sound to be able to perceive it. There needs to be different modes of perception enabled by the website. Second, for operable, it's very similar, and that basically says that anything that's interactive on the website needs to be operable by people in the way that they can operate it. So it needs to be operable using, say, only a keyboard, or maybe a sip and puff switch, or maybe a keyless keyboard, or something like that. Okay. Next, understandable. So this basically is that the information needs to be understandable, the relationships, how you use the web page needs to be understandable to people. Not something that they have to kind of figure out themselves, and a big kind of learning hurdle to get over websites, or to be able to interact successfully with websites. And one thing the WCAG does cover are cognitive disabilities. So this is useful for lots of people, and it's particularly helpful for people who have various cognitive disabilities to be able to successfully interact with a website. And then finally, the principle of robust, and this is the technical standards. This is basically saying that your website needs to be set up in such a way that assistive technology can understand it, and it needs to be compatible with assistive technology. The WCAG's also divided amongst 3 levels of guidelines, A, AA, and AAA. Single A is the least stringent, and AAA is the most stringent. And AA is the most important level to target, because that's what satisfies the current laws. AAA is not that widely used because it imposed some very significant design constraints on websites. And so AA is really what people shoot for. So first, I encourage you to read the WCAG if you never have. The website is really good. It's actually not that difficult to understand, and the website has lots of great examples of what is accessible and what is not, and to really help you understand the spirit of the standard. But the way it's written is, there's the principles, and then there's a bunch of individual guidelines after the principles. And each one is marked with, you have to satisfy this one to meet A, or satisfy that one to meet AAA, or so forth. And if you're shooting for AA, you need to satisfy all of the single A and AA standards. So they kind of stack on top of each other. All right. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them. So now let's talk about applying those standards to dashboard design in Tableau. So now we're going to get into kind of the really practical part where we talk about best practices for applying those standards. The first thing I want to note, though, is it important to understand that accessibility is a design choice, just like any other design choice that you make when you're developing a dashboard or a website. It's something that you really need to think about up front. It's a requirement that you need to understand when you're developing the dashboard, not something that you try to do later. Because you can't make any arbitrary dashboard or really any arbitrary website accessible. You may design yourself into a corner such that in order to make something more accessible, you have to really change something fundamental about the dashboard or about the website. And so I encourage everyone who's trying to create accessible content, don't think about it at the end. Think about it up front when you're thinking about all of the other requirements. And I know we are experiencing this right now at Tableau because our whole platform was not designed with accessibility in mind. So the things that we've done, we've had to go in and retrofit, and it's way harder to do that after the fact, especially when it's all hand-coded like all of our stuff is. Okay, so first thing, there's a couple of basic things that you have to keep in mind when developing accessible dashboards. So the first is that it is a subset of Tableau functionality right now that you can use in a dashboard that you want to be accessible. We are pretty early on our accessibility journey in 10.5, which was Q1 of 2017. That was the very first time that anything in Tableau was accessible at all, except by accident. There were some things that worked by accident, but most things, didn't. So what we did in Tableau 10.5 is we made it so that certain elements in dashboards that are published to the web are able to be used with screen readers, able to be used with the keyboard, and so forth, and follow the WCAG AA standards. And so this is a comprehensive list of everything that you can use in a dashboard that you mean to be accessible. So we can go through those. So the workbook tabs, so if you show the tabs across the top of your workbook, if there are multiple pages, those tabs are accessible. Dashboard titles can be read by a screen reader or assistive technology. Views themselves, which are the visualizations that are in the dashboard, so those are accessible in a very particular way. There's no interactivity within the visualization. That's something that we need to do, and it's actually a pretty big technical challenge to do. But the way it works with views is the titles themselves are accessible, their captions are accessible, and then finally, the view data window for each view is accessible itself. And so that's the trick for giving someone who is unable to perceive through vision the ability to get at the data is you have them open up the view data window, which basically is a table of the underlying data in a plain HTML table that can be navigated using a keyboard and assistive technology. And I'll show exactly what that looks like when I do the demo. Then in terms of filters, the list and drop-down list filters are what we have right now. Categorical legends, text objects on dashboards can be read. Web page objects as well. So if you embed a web page into the dashboard, keyboard navigation will just flow right into that web page like it's part of the dashboard. And then new in Tableau 2018.3, which we're releasing next week, are accessibility for the image object. So now you can actually assign alt text to images that you put in dashboards, which is required to make them accessible. And then the new button objects. So the buttons that we added to allow you to navigate between pages in a workbook, those are accessible. And I'm super happy about that because it's a brand new feature and we made them accessible right out of the box. And so that was a non-retrofit kind of deal. So you can have tooltip text for them, which is read by the screen reader or assistive technology, and you can press the button using just the keyboard. So that's really nice. And then finally, the toolbar that shows up by default at the bottom of Viz's and Tableau Server and Online, you can disable it, or on Tableau Public where you can't disable that toolbar. So that's accessible as well. Okay, so you've now designed your dashboard to use only accessible objects on it. You then need to publish it to one of our web-based platforms and then embed it inside of an accessible web page. So you take an HTML page, and if you don't know how to embed, you basically can go to Server, Online, or Public, and you get what's called an embed code, which is a string of HTML and JavaScript that you just paste into the web page, and then it'll stick the dashboard right in the middle of your web page. And so when I show the demo, I'm going to be opening an HTML page that's just sitting on my desktop that has the embed codes for the dashboards in them. Yes?
So does that mean that Tableau Public is not accessible right now?
So yeah, so good question. So the question is, does that mean that Tableau Public is not accessible right now? So the only thing we have is the potential to have accessible content, the dashboards themselves. The UIs around the content, and this is true for Server, Online, and Public, are not accessible. We are working on that for Server and Online right now to start moving to where have the kind of when you log in to Server and Online and you have the experience to be able to browse and find and view dashboards. We're working on having that be accessible, and that's something that we're working on currently. We have a bunch of redesign that we're doing of that experience to make it easier to set up spaces and stuff like that. And so we're working accessibility into our development of that kind of new experience for the Tableau Server and Online UI. Yes? So the UI, like the Tableau Public website is not, but if you create and publish a dashboard to Tableau Public, you can embed that dashboard in another web page, and that dashboard has the possibility of being accessible if you designed it correctly.
And if you publish, if you create a dashboard using the Tableau application, desktop application, and publish it internally, is that accessible?
What do you mean by publish internally?
On our Tableau server.
Yes, if you follow all of the right guidelines and everything that I'm talking about here, you can make an accessible dashboard.
Accessible is it's not a very solid term.
Accessible means WCAG level AA, that follows the WCAG level AA guidelines.
Okay.
That's what?
We have 10.1. So
Okay.
10.1 is
You have to be at least at 10.5. That was when we started introducing that. Okay. Yes?
And so just to be clear, our Tableau server are things that are available for campus-wide. We've taken them and put them in, embedded it as an iframe.
Yes.
In another HTML site.
Yes.
And that's what makes it.
That's what makes it accessible.
Not that when they go to server to get it, they couldn't see it, but by
Yeah, well,
having it in the iframe, they can.
yeah, so what you'd find if they went directly to server is all of the stuff around the dashboard, that's what wouldn't be accessible. Once they navigated into the dashboard, it would be just as accessible as it was if it were embedded. But it's all of the stuff around it. So how you navigate Tableau server, all of the what we call the Chrome of Tableau server, kind of the basic interface. And then inside of that Chrome is where your content sits that you create. So this is back here.
Maybe you're going to address this with the embed code that's on the screen here. Between these two questions here, thought I had you, and I want to make sure.
Yes.
To make it accessible, that is your design choice in building a dashboard. If I build it using desktop, I publish it to Tableau Public, or
Yes.
I go to server, or all three, that dashboard is accessible.
Correct.
The WCAG, the AA.
It can be if you do it right.
If
Yeah.
you do it right, so I have to adhere to that. But that's where we're talking about making something accessible.
Correct.
And then where I place it,
Yes.
right, that the tools that I use to create the dashboard itself and where I place it may not be WCAG double A
Correct.
dashboard.
But your dashboard is.
Right.
Right.
So then if I take that code that's accessible, that matches an accessible dashboard, and I place that into an accessible website, that's now content going to environment, and they both happen to be WCAG double A.
Yes. Yeah, because the way the WCAG is you evaluate the entire page. You don't just evaluate part of the page. And so, if someone embedded a Tableau dashboard inside of a non-accessible website, the user may not even be able to get to the dashboard in that non-accessible website, for example. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, and yes. Yeah.
Okay, so what I have been told, the definition of accessible is if you can navigate to your the container through your keyboard, you are about 80% accessible. You don't have to use your mouse. If you can go through different tabs, different sections using the keyboard, you are almost there. Is that the right definition?
So the definition, I should have said this. The definition, when I say something is accessible, I mean that it follows all of the WCAG level AA guidelines. And there are many of those guidelines that address many different aspects of accessibility. Keyboard navigation is one of them, and that's a big one because lots of people need the ability to do keyboard navigation, but it's not the only thing. And I'm going to go in, once I get out of this, I'm going to go into the other kinds of accessibility that are relevant to Tableau content and what that means. So yeah, so keyboard is important, but that's not all. There are more things that you have to do. And when I say something is accessible or not accessible, that's shorthand for aligns with the WCAG AA guidelines, is what I mean. Okay? All right. Okay, so speaking of the WCAG AA guidelines, so there are a bunch of them, but there are really only 5 that you need to worry about as an author in Tableau, as someone creating content. Many of the WCAG guidelines are about things that are not relevant to Tableau, like sound and things like that. Or interact, if you embedded a video or something through a web page, then you'd have a whole other set of standards, but I'm talking about just basic Tableau content. A lot of the WCAG is just not applicable to it. And these are the guidelines that you need to follow as a creator. Some of the other guidelines, we had to make our software conform to them. So for example, making stuff keyboard navigable, making stuff visible to screen readers. That's stuff that we had to do on our side that as a dashboard creator, you can't do. Only we can do that. But this is stuff that you as an author need to follow. So let's go through all of these and talk about what they mean and best practices for dealing with them. So first, guideline 1.1 is about text alternatives. So this says that any non-textual content on a web page or in a dashboard needs to have a textual alternative that performs the same function. And what this is for compatibility with assistive technology, so that assistive technology can access that textual description and then either display it like on a Braille display or read it over a screen reader. This is key for the perceivable principle. And so, if you ever go to a web page and you notice that there is a description of like you see an image and then it's like you see a little description that says image of girl with cat, or something like that, that's meant to help make it more accessible. So if someone who's navigating the web page and can't see it, they're like, oh, there's an image of a girl with a cat. That's kind of a textual equivalent. So for Tableau, this is a super critical one because the main content in a Tableau dashboard is a visualization, which is inherently non-textual content. And so the main trick for it is to use the view data window. And I'll show you how this works, where you navigate to you literally use the tab key to move key focus to the view, and then you use a particular keystroke that opens up the view data window, which is a table of data. And you can then navigate around that to get all of the various values in each cell of that table. Another thing that's good to do, another best practice, is to provide a textual description of the visualization in the caption for the visualization. So this would orient someone to, well, what is this visualization? What data is it showing? What's on the x-axis? What's on the y-axis? Kind of a high-level meta narrative of the dashboard. Now, it can't be data-driven, it's static, so it isn't able to show or have anything to do with the actual data that's on the view at that point, but it does give someone an orientation as to what that view is meant to have. If you are using an image object, you need to assign alt text to the image object so that when someone is navigating around the dashboard using the keyboard and assistive technology, you have some description of the image. And again, I'm going to demo all of this. And then finally, if you are using a button object, then if you assign tooltips to that button object, those tooltips are read by assistive technology. So someone would know what the function of that button is, like where you navigate to or something with the button. Yes?
Do you have to display the caption?
Yes, that's a great question. Do you have to display the caption? The answer is yes, you do have to display the caption. And what you're going to see, especially in my demo, is my dashboard has tons of text on it. So one of the things that you can do is, this is kind of a classic Tableau trick, is you make the text in the caption the same color as the background. And so what happens is when someone tabs to the view, Tableau says, or the screen reader will say, this is an image, it'll give you the title of the dashboard, and then it'll read the caption for the dashboard, is how that works. And it'll give you the keystroke combination, and it'll say, press these keys to open the view data window. Yes, and then.
Wouldn't that fail usual checks in terms of visible contrast?
Well, so.
I know that's not the point of the text.
That's not the point of the text. Well, because it's text, but it's not. So the text shows up as like the alternative text for, it's not visual text at that point. And it shows up as kind of the alternative text for the image. So it's just like if you had, functionally it becomes just like if you had alt text for an image that's not visible on a web page, but is accessible through a screen reader.
So I understand that, but if you were doing a check in terms of because they have the automatic checkers now.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it just fail?
So few comments about automatic checkers. Don't rely on automatic checkers because they give you tons of false positive and tons of, false negatives. And so when we do we use a third party to do testing for us to prepare our VPAT. What we do is we create a dashboard that follows all the right guidelines, and then they go and then they test it. And they test it using a combination of in-person, actually sitting there with the software, and they do use the automatic checker tools to check some technical things about how tags are assigned and things like that. But they mainly use actually sitting down and interacting with the page. Because you can develop a page that a checker will say is all good that is not accessible at all. And like, if you run a checker on a Tableau page, it'll, like, if you have for example, a legend, and it has like the little glyph next to each legend, it'll see each one of those things as an image. And it'll say, oh, you don't have alt text for that. And it's like, this is like a group of things, and you can define it as something different than that that is okay. But a checker doesn't know that. So what really matters is, the WCAG is not a checker says this is okay. The WCAG is like a functional description. And so what it matters is what someone's actual experience of the page is really what the standard is.
I'm only wondering
Yeah.
because federal government always uses automatic checkers.
Mm-hmm.
So if it comes back negative, you're going to have to fix it anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know when I've had, so in my experience talking to federal customers, it varies widely. Some use only checkers, which is, in my view, missing the point. Because again, it's like, okay, good, the checker said yes, and then it's not really actually accessible if someone tries to use it. And then others rely mainly on actual interactivity with a person. So it really depends. So, yes?
When relying on a screen reader,
Mhm.
is there an advantage or is there a difference for the experience if you're using just straight up text objects to hide that text or tuck it away versus using the actual caption?
Yeah, so the thing that's good about the caption is that it's affiliated with the view. And so that means when you tab to the view, it'll read the title of the view and then the caption for the view. If it's just a text object, it's just like free text. It has no affiliation with the view itself. So it's better to use the caption. Okay. Now there's something else I want to talk about, some third-party options. So back in the spring, we released dashboard extensions that allow third parties to go and create things that you can put on dashboards. And there are a few of them that, though the authors did not intend this, actually have great applicability for accessibility. So the first one is a extension by one of our community members over in London. It's called a data tables extension. And what you do is you drop this extension in a dashboard, and it asks you, it brings up a little configuration dialog and says, which view in your dashboard do you want to display as a table? And then there are some options, some configuration options, and then it basically creates a zone in your dashboard that looks like this. And what's cool about it is that the standard HTML widget that he used for the table is really accessible. So you can totally navigate this table directly inside of the dashboard without having to do the opening of the view data thing. And this is super new. It just came out a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Using extensions, how risky is it to use extensions when I upgrade my Tableau from one version to another version? Do they stay intact?
Great question. So the question is, how risky is it to use extensions? I would say extensions in general are buyer beware for a couple of reasons. One is, so our intent is to they use an API, and we have to basically maintain that API so that they will work from version to version. And so if they don't work from version to version, it's usually because we screwed something up. We changed the API, the way the API works, and so they've programmed, the extension breaks, but it's our fault. The more thing to be cognizant of is that these extensions are community created. So this is a really nice one, but it's a guy doing this in his spare time. This is not his job. And so is he gonna maintain it? And extensions do have limitations. So right now, for example, and we're working on fixing this, if you were to print a dashboard that has an extension on it or export an image of that dashboard, it shows up as a blank spot. It doesn't render in the printout. We're working on that to fix that. The other thing is they don't yet work on Tableau Public. We're also working on that. So there are some issues, and one of the things, for example, is they have no knowledge of the formatting of your dashboard. So they're not gonna match the font of your dashboard. They're not gonna match the color scheme of your dashboard. We're also working on things like that so that they are more native-like. But right now, there are certain things you can't do with them. But it's super useful, and some of the things that I like about it, and this is stuff we should really do in the view data window, is you can reorder the columns and you can rename the columns as well. Because in the view data window, what shows up as the column names, if it's an aggregated data value, it'll have the aggregation information. So it'll say something like sum of sales rather than just sales. And when a screen reader reads it, it'll be like left parentheses, sum, right parentheses, sales. And that's just not good. That's not a good user experience. And the next one, which is super exciting, there are a couple of natural language generation extensions. And what these do is they generate textual narratives to describe the data in the visualization. And what I think this is, I would say they're still pretty early, and it's a developing technology that's just going to get better over time. But they point in the direction of something that's really good for this application. Because, right now, the way we give someone who is unable to see the dashboard the information is a giant table of data. That has limited usage depending on the nature of that data. What this does is it will automatically do things like tell you what the maximum value is, tell you whether a trend is increasing or decreasing over time, things like that. And these are the kinds of things that you get by looking at it visually that's hard to figure out if you're just looking at tables of numbers. And so it starts to give some of that same high-level meta narrative of a visualization in a textual form. And I'll show you how one of these works. And these are two companies that are doing this. Automated Insights is one, and Narrative Science is the other. And I believe they both have booths in the expo hall. All right, how am I doing on time? What time does this end? 1. Okay. I'm going to blow through a few of these because y'all are asking great questions. Thanks. Okay. So next, there's something, the Adaptable Guideline, and it's basically, when it talks about it, it's the relationships of things on the dashboard need to be clear to someone, and how you tell someone about the relationships can't depend on sensory characteristics of things. So you can't say something like, click on the button at the top right of the screen, because that assumes you know what the top right of the screen is, and someone who's navigating, say, using a screen reader does not know that. Yeah.
It just occurred to me the right side,
Mm-hmm.
so you can make it, so this is a little bit bulky because you have a text says legend for numbers of students for SAT scores. You can make that text white in color,
Yeah, you could do that too.
right?
Yep.
So it'll be a check mark.
Yeah, so that's another application. So here, my kind of classic example is it's super common practice in Tableau. If you have a legend for a chart, you put it like next to the chart or in the white space, and you don't show its title. And someone is just assumed to know that it goes with that chart. Well, if you're navigating with a screen reader, you wouldn't know that. And so you need to give it a title that affiliates it. And again, just like with the caption, you can basically make that text invisible, and a screen reader will still read it when you navigate to it. Okay. Next is distinguishable. And so these are the kind of things that are true. When you asked about is keyboard navigation 80%, it's like, well, there's a lot. So big thing, important for visualizations is that you can't use color as the only way to distinguish visual elements from each other. There needs to be some other way to distinguish them. And so in this example, we have a line chart where if you just had the color and someone were colorblind, they wouldn't necessarily be able to distinguish the elements from each other. So you have to add other things like, say, shapes on top of the lines, or like end caps to the ends of lines, so that someone can be like, oh, that's that line, I can follow it. And I don't have to use only the color. It's not just the green line, because they may not be able to perceive green. It's the line with squares, something like that. The other big distinguishable is the contrast between foreground and background of text. And so on the left, we have a faint gray text on a white background. There has to be a certain contrast, and that fails the check. A darker gray on the white passes the check. Luckily, the default text color in Tableau is good. So if you just use the default text color on white background, that does pass the contrast guideline. Another thing that I want to mention, I am talking about WCAG 2.0. Just this past spring, WCAG 2.1 came out. Section 508 does not yet align with that. I'm not sure what the timing is on that. It adds some additional things, and it adds some things that are going to be challenging for us, because right now in WCAG 2.0, this color contrast thing is only for text. In WCAG 2.1, it's for everything. And so that becomes a real challenge, like when you talk about marks and marks that can overlap each other on vises. If you just strictly applied the guideline, every mark that interacted with or overlapped with every other mark, there had to be a contrast, enough contrast between them. There is no way we could make a color palette that any mark overlaying any other mark is going to have enough contrast. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. It's probably just something we can't solve. Okay, next things about navigable. So there are a number of different things that are important here. One is the focus order of the dashboard. So when you tab around, it is in a logical order. And you also need to have headings and labels for everything to describe their purpose. So good titles for filters, good titles for views, and things like that. Dashboard focus order is a bit of a challenge, because the way the focus order is determined is by the order in which you place zones in a dashboard, which is kind of weird. So we are going to be working on making it like have a logical focus order by default, which is usually just kind of left to right, top to bottom, is how focus order people typically want it to work. But there's a trick. You can actually edit the XML of the dashboard to reassign the focus order. And I have a topic on the community forums that shows you exactly how to do that. And I have a link to that here. Okay, and then in general, you need to provide people with assistance on using the dashboard. So good instructions that talk about everything that is on the dashboard, how to use filters and those sorts of things. Okay, blow through a case study. Here's our dashboard that we had. Remember our good friend, the SAT score dashboard from an accessibility view. It's got some issues. Its marks are distinguishable only by color. Contrast ratio for text is too low. There's some bad ones like yellow text on a light gray. That's hard for pretty much anyone to read. There are really not enough captions, titles, and those sorts of things to describe the dashboard. And then the focus order is confusing because the developer didn't do the trick and set the focus order correctly. So this is what it looks like, and I reworked it. I always say I hit it with the accessibility stick to make it more accessible, and this is what I came out with. So let's go through it real quickly. So first is I use a text color that meets the minimum contrast guideline. That's just the default text color in Tableau. I added, by the way, an image object with a logo for Hypothetical University, just so I could set the alt text and show that off. I also added an image object to the top that we have documentation in our online help that explains how to use the keyboard on each of the elements in a Tableau viz, like how to interact with filters and those sorts of things. And so that image is just a link to that online help file. Next, I added a block of text at the top that gives descriptions and how to use the dashboard. I have captions for each of the charts that describe at a high level what these charts are. Again, could have made these, could have colored them white so they don't show up. I have button objects that I added as well to navigate to other worksheets, and I have tooltip text for those. I used only the accessible filters, made sure that the filter titles talked about exactly what they're for, and that the instructions at the top reference the titles exactly. They don't casually reference the title, they just say specifically what the title is. Gave titles for the legends that affiliate them with their graphs. I use shape marks encoded with color so that you can have something other than color to tell these marks apart from each other. I did use the colorblind color palette. We have a colorblind color palette, and it's made for red-green colorblindness. It is not sufficient, but it is helpful for the 5% of people in the world red-green colorblind. So I think it's a good practice, even though it's not sufficient for the WCAG. I also did some text simplification and removed some redundancies of the text so that the screen reader isn't just constantly saying stuff it doesn't need to. And then I set the focus order to be what you want it to be. Okay, let's then do a real quick demo. And this is when I'll need the sound from the computer. Okay, and so I'm on my Mac. Here is that web page. It's published to Tableau Online, and this is just an HTML page. The only thing in the HTML page is that dashboard embedded into it. So, it's a normal dashboard in Tableau. I can interact with it with the mouse. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the screen reader on my computer.
VoiceOver on Chrome, case study
go.
demo, Google Chrome window, workbook, case study demo, frame has keyboard focus.
So
are
I'm on a
currently
Mac,
frame.
so this is the
To enter
VoiceOver
web
screen
area,
reader.
Press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
If you ever heard of screen reader, they can be interesting to use when you're new to them. Screen readers have a lot of options about how verbose they are. I've turned on all of the verbosity and hints and everything so that you can see everything that gets said. But some people turn off hints and things like that. So I'm going to start by just interacting around. I can hit the tab key. Oops, I don't have focus. There we go.
Visited, link, image, information about keyboard access for this dashboard, application.
So
you are currently
it
on a
says
link.
it's an image.
To click this link,
I
press
had
Control, Option, Space.
Alt text for it, which says information about keyboard help. That's something I assigned. I can continue to click around.
Selected, radio, 2007,
I can
selected,
filter my data.
2017, radio, 2000, leaving list box.
Let's say I'm only
All,
going to
female,
show
male, unchecked, male,
information
checkbox.
for
You are
the
male,
female
unchecked,
students
check, leaving list box, search,
who
enter,
work
all,
in,
checked, checkbox, are all
or who are
unchecked,
in
all,
the,
checkbox, communication,
let's
unchecked, dentist,
say,
education, engineering,
engineering
checkbox,
and dentistry
check,
schools.
dentistry, checkbox, cancel, button, apply, button, dentistry, checked, checkbox, 4 of 9, application, filter,
So now
select
I've
academic
filtered the
division,
data
inclusive,
down.
collapsed, menu pop-up button, multiple percentage of students by SAT decile, image, application. Percentage of students by SAT decile is a line graph showing
That's the
percentage of
caption.
students within each SAT decile. SAT decile is on the x-axis. Percentage of students is on the y-axis. Each line shows the data for a different academic division. Press Escape to clear any marked selections. To open the View Data window, press Control-Shift-Enter. You are currently on an image.
Okay, so I'm going to press Control-Enter.
Web
And it's
content.
going to
View
open
data.
up
Web content.
a table of the data.
You are currently on web content. To enter the web area, table 4 columns, 29 rows.
So then I can
You are
navigate
currently on
around
a
this table.
Inside academic year, row 2 of 29, 2017. College name, engineering, column 2 of 4. Row 3 of
So
29.
that's how you can get
engineering.
access to the data.
You are currently on a text element inside of a cell.
And I can
Percentage
go
of
back
students
and
by SAT
continue to move
decile,
around.
image application.
If
Percentage
I
of students by SAT
wanted
decile is a line
to-
graph showing percentage of students within each SAT decile. SAT decile is on the x-axis. Percentage of students is heading level 2, heading
can
level
move
3,
around the
heading level,
headings.
heading level 3, heading level 1. SAT performance of admitted students.
Can read the text.
Hypothetical universe visited. Link. The SAT performance of admitted students dashboard uses 2 graphs to use the
If you
select
hear someone who
academic
really
year,
uses a
select
screen
gender,
reader,
and
they
select
turn up
academic
the
division controls
text
to filter the
really
data in the 2
fast.
graphs.
It's amazing.
You are currently on a text element.
Okay, so that's what it's like to use something with a screen reader in Tableau. But I also want to show you the
Accessible dashboard extensions demo. Web content.
with those extensions.
You are currently on
that
web
I
content.
mentioned.
To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow. Workbook, sales and profit by category and subcategory. Link, copy. Copy.
this
link,
right here-
ENUS. Leaving frame.
That's wrong,
Link,
sorry.
leaving frame. Link, ENUS. This analysis
go.
measures sales by category and by subcategory.
So this is a
You are currently on a
computer-generated
text element
narrative and
inside of a frame.
description of this
To exit
data.
this web area, press Control, Option, list 2 items. Bullet, total sales is $2.3 million across all 3 entities, 1 of 2. You are currently on a text element. Bullet, the minimum value is $719,047. Office
So the
supplies,
computer
and the
did this
maximum is
for me.
$836,154.
And so this can give someone a nice high-level
Technology,
description
a difference of
of things.
$117,107, averaging
So
$765,734.
this one is the narrative science
202.
extension
You are currently on a text element.
by a third party. Yep. And then real quick,
Leaving for link. Link 10. Show
Table.
entry. Search. Edit tag. Category. Activate to sort column descending. Table not found.
Oh.
You are currently on
That's not true.
subcategory. Activate to sort category. Leaving table. Search. Edit text. Applicate. Table 4 columns. 11 rows.
so right there
Show 1 to
inside the
10, 17
dashboard, we've
entry.
got a nice
Category,
accessible
row 2 of
table.
11. Subcategory. Profit. Activate to sort column ascending. Minus $17,725.48.
I think a better
column 3 of
experience than the
4.
View Data window.
You are currently on a text element
Caveat
inside
emptor,
of a cell.
it's an extension, so it has some of the drawbacks of extensions. So that's it. Sorry for the rush to the finish. Got a lot of good questions. A few more things, demos. For resources, I recently, a couple months ago, created a FAQ on our community forums. If you just search for accessibility FAQ, and you can get these slides, and there's a link there, that has basically links to all of the resources that we have and some good third-party resources as well. It's where you can find the explanation of how to set the focus order of the dashboard, a link to a color contrast analyzer tool so you can check your color contrast, those sorts of things. Okay, and yep, this is the last one. And I think there's about to be another presentation on extensions if you're interested in learning more about extensions. And then there was a good presentation yesterday about navigation. But I encourage you, please, fill out an evaluation. It's super helpful for me and for us to get evaluations on how well this content matched your expectations and was useful and so forth. And so thank you for coming. And I hope you have a good rest of your conference.